Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do on the KidLit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature, picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels too. Whether you're an adult reading to your inner child or connecting the young readers in your lives with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. Each week, we'll talk to a different children's literature author and discuss their books, their hopes and dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. So, grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of KidLit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the KidLit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie, your KidLit loving host, inviting you back for another bookish conversation with a children's literature author. Today, I'm talking with Gayle Forman. Gayle is the author of multiple best-selling novels for young adults, including the Just One series, I Was Here, Where She Went, the #1 New York Times bestseller, If I Stay, and one of my favorites, I Have Lost My Way. But she also writes books for middle grade readers too, books like Frankie and Bug, and her newest novel, Not Nothing. Today, we'll get to know Gayle and her books a little bit better and take a deeper dive into her newest, Not Nothing, a book earning multiple starred reviews and a book that has my whole heart. So let's get right to it. Gayle, welcome to the KidLit Love podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm feeling the KidLit love already.
Good. I am glad. I I love always talking to authors, but I love talking to authors when I have read multiple novels that they have written, and I have loved all of them. And I think that your books really live up to what your website says, which is all the feels. I have all the feels when I am reading your books, and I cannot wait to dive into Not Nothing, because even though I would say they are all a tie for my favorites, this one truly does just have my whole heart for so many reasons. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, and I appreciate that. And I'm so glad you feel that way about Not Nothing because it captured my heart in a pretty special way. Josie just kind of wormed his way in there.
Yes. Yes, and all the others. They're all
Yeah.
they're all stuck there, moving around a little bit. Now, before we get to Not Nothing, let's start with the traditional way of talking about you. So tell us about you. Give us a little sneak peek into your background and how you came to be in the children's literature world.
I came to be in the children's literature world a little bit backwards, which is that I grew up writing and making up stories and never ever connected it to a thing that I would do as a living or as a job. I did not sort of have writers in my world. And back then, it wasn't like social media gave you a glimpse into sort of what a writer's life was, but I just always loved to write. And I took 3 years off, between high school and college traveling, and finally decided it was time for me to go to college, and, I wanted to become a doctor and work for Doctors Without Borders. And then I got to college and did, like, 2 terms of pre-med. I was like, "Not for me," and wound up sort of backing into journalism. And I love journalism, and I was obsessed with a magazine that you might remember called Sassy.
Yes, I do.
And I really wanted to write for Sassy. So even when I was in college, I was like, I was drawn to young people and young stories. And by the time I graduated and moved to New York, Sassy had kind of died. And so I went to work at 17. And I worked there for years. And after that, I just wrote about young people and sort of social justice issues. And I loved it. I loved writing about it. I loved writing for that audience. But when I sort of sat down to write my first young adult novel, it was by accident. I had a baby. I'd been doing all this sort of travel journalism. I couldn't go anywhere. And I wrote my first young adult novel just sort of because I desperately needed sort of something to do to make money. Had this newborn. And it was like this aha moment because I had been doing this and drawn to this my entire life. I loved writing in this voice and I loved writing for this readership. And we're going to get to the idea of rise to the occasion in a bit, I'm sure. But like young readers, in the beginning, I was surprised that they cared about the kind of issues that I would write about. Like my 17 sent me to like Sierra Leone to write about the child soldiers fighting in the Civil War there. But I just realized like they are capable of so much more empathy and deep thought and critical thinking than we give them credit for. And when you give them the opportunity to rise to the occasion, they rise and rise and rise. And so ever since then, this has just been the thing that I do and I love to do. And I feel so grateful that I get to do it.
Oh, I love that. I love that it was always kind of part of your story there, but it just took a while to come to the forefront and then be the thing that
Yeah.
kind of moves you forward. Ah.
Yeah. Like you dumb dumb. It's like right there in front of you.
Well, and readers are responding, right? I have mentioned I've loved so many of your books. I think my favorite, as I mentioned, was your young adult novel, I've Lost My
It
Way.
makes me happy. I love that book too. Those three characters. I mean, I love them all. So
Yeah. And that's something that I've noticed as I read your books is that those characters, they stay with me. I think about them long after I am done reading your book, whether it was those characters, whether it was Frankie and Bug, whether now, it's Alex and Josie and oh, so many of them. So I just I have so many things I want to ask you about this book. So let's just jump to it. But before we do, actually, we need to give readers, listeners, a little bit of a preview. So, Not Nothing, it's a multi-generational novel. There's hope, there's compassion, there's forgiveness. Tell us in your own words, give us a little snippet without spoilers of what this book was about. And then I just want to dive right into it.
my very, very shorthand is that it is The Princess Bride meets Schindler's List, which will probably make sense to you because you've read it, and to other people, it's like, what? But what it is a story about a 12-year-old boy named Alex who does something truly bad, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. And as a result, he is arrested and he's sort of court ordered to volunteer at an assisted living facility while he sort of awaits his hearing at the end of the summer. And he really, really, really does not want to be there. He is angry. He is resentful. It's even worse when he meets this other 12-year-old who's volunteering there, this sort of bossy do gooder named Maya Jade. But he winds up in the room of Josie, who is a 107-year-old Polish Jewish Holocaust survivor um, who is waiting to die. He is 107. He has outlived everything and everyone he knows and loves. And he stopped talking for the last 5 years because he's kind of run out of things to say. But when this boy enters his room, for reasons neither Josie nor Alex initially understand, Josie begins telling him a story of him in 1930s and pre-war and wartime Poland and a young woman named Olga who worked for his family's business and who started out kind of this sort of small and bitter person. She was frustrated with sort of the limitations of her life, but by being given the opportunity to rise to the occasion by Josie, and the two of them become friends, they fall in love, and she winds up saving his life and becoming a hero. And so he
So,
tells Alex the story, and in doing so, kind of changes both of their lives.
yeah, all of these characters have such a beautiful part in the book. And we learn from Alex, the 12-year-old, we learn his story. Then we learn from Josie, the 107-year-old. And then we actually learn from the story itself. I love the format, how I feel like, I got both characters, but then I got this third story of one of those characters. And so I'd love to ask you how that format came to be. Was it always like that in your mind? Did that evolve and develop as you go? Because as a reader, that made it so powerful to get the two stories and then the backstory behind the story and the signals in the book when I knew it was coming.
Oh, well, I'm so glad you felt that way. And I think storytelling is so powerful. There's a reason that this is something that we have done since language evolved and the way we tell stories might change, but it is hugely important, sort of helping us understand our world. So I knew from the beginning that I wanted to write a book that was narrated by this 107-year-old man. And that's kind of a tough sell for like a middle grade novel. Like, I want to write a middle grade novel that is narrated by a 107-year-old man. And I remember telling my editor about it. She's like, all right, prove it to me. And it was essential that Josie could narrate because he sees the world with a very unique perspective because he's been in it for so long and what he's been through. So I knew I wanted him to tell his story and I wanted him to tell Alex's story. It took me a while to kind of figure all of that out and figure how I could have this narrator who was old, um, be also be able to channel Alex in a way so that when you're reading it as a 12-year-old, you're going to recognize Alex, you're going to recognize Maya Jade. It's in their worlds. It's you feel it ideally as they are feeling it. But then occasionally Josie will pull back and sort of talk about this because he's telling the story to somebody. And then occasionally he will pull back even more as he tells Alex the story of Olga. So yeah, there's a lot in here about the importance of storytelling and how it helps us make sense of our world and become the people we want to be.
That's a key thing you just said, become the people we want to be. And I was struck as I was reading it, how, as you mentioned, how important the idea of story is. There's Alex stories. We learn Josie's story. We even learn Maya Jade with a hyphen, by the way. We
I
learn,
hyphen Jade. Hyphen is very important. She can tell if you're not using the hyphen.
and I practiced saying it out loud with and without the hyphen. And I went, she's right. She's right. I can tell the difference. But you have all of those stories. And as a reader, because you're just so drawn into those, I felt like you can't help but think of your own. Like, what is my story? What is the story that I would tell? What would I look back on? How would I, as we've said, rise up to the occasion? And I felt like there were just so many different ways that a reader could jump into the story, whether it was identifying with Alex or Maya Jade or Josie. Um, but even though there are so many different stories to enter into, it was just this seamless experience, start to finish. I pretty much read this in one sitting because I was not going to not find out what was going to happen um, at the end. And all of the characters, in some way, had this beautiful, I don't know if I call it a transformation or a moment, an understanding, a realization, a personal growth moment that just so beautifully came together. So I'd love for you to talk about that aspect of the book.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because I love my little side characters. And I think that they you may not see them on page, but the off page everybody has this huge story to tell. And one of the inspirations for this story was that I used to volunteer in an assisted living facility, and I would visit this one woman every week, and she and I became wonderful friends. And she told me her story of sort of surviving in 1930s Hungary as one of Raoul Wallenberg's Jews. She was sheltered by him. But it just got me like realizing how everybody in that facility, you look at them and they're playing bingo and you're like, oh, cute little old people, but it's a caricature, and they've all had these big, full, rich lives with these incredible stories to tell. So in some cases, Alex, by starting to ask those questions, he kind of skims the surface and he learns that Minna has a story to tell. And it's not as like dramatic as Josie's, but it is a story and it's her story. And I think one of the things I would love to sort of see come out of this book is sort of see some more intergenerational dialogue about that, because I think we tend to sort of see like old people like they're our grandparents, they like send us gifts and da da da, but they actually had these full rich lives and they still have these full rich lives, and we can grow and grow and grow until we die, as is the case. So I that was very important to kind of show all of that and even the little ones. But yes, how are you going to know about all these people? How are you going to know what a 12-year-old and a 107-year-old have in common? Seemingly nothing on the outset, unless you engage one another and start asking about each other's lives, which is a form of storytelling. And that's what happens with Alex and Josie. And it really does change their lives.
It does. And when I turned the last page of the book, admittedly, I just had to sit and be for a few minutes. Like, I had to let it soak in. There's a part of the book, and I'm not spoiling when I say this, but as Alex is listening to Josie's stories, he typically in each session has questions and wants to know more and can't wait for the next part. But then there's a moment where there aren't any questions because he just has to sit with what he has just heard and what he has just discovered. And that's how I felt when I closed the last page of I just want to sit with it for a while and let all of these multiple stories just sink in and really think about this idea that these 12-year-olds cultivated, which is, ultimately a project called Operation Rise, about rising to the occasion in our own lives, whatever our stories are. And all of our stories are varied, and some are hard, and some are harder, and some even yet are harder than that. But there's always a moment, whether it comes to you when you're 12 or you're 107. And I needed to sit with that for a while. And I love that you've taken this Operation Rise and it's a thing. Like it's a thing now that we can take part of. So please talk about that because it may be a thing for kids and middle grade readers, but this adult needs Operation Rise too.
I think we all do, and if I were not on a podcast with you right now, I would take a minute and marinate in all the lovely things that you just said, because I will tell you that for an author to hear that as a reader, I know what that experience is like, so just thank you.
Welcome.
And there's a big theme of the book. I would say the major theme of the book is about what does it mean to rise to the occasion of your life? What does it mean if no one has ever invited you to be your better self? What does it mean if you've had opportunities and invitations to be your worst self? And it's hard to explain or define what rise to the occasion means because it is so personal. And I think people tend to sort of default to it's a good deed. It's more than that. It is something that connects you with the person that deep down you want to be. And you know it when you get there because you just feel bigger. You feel connected to something more than like your, basic little petty human concerns. And so Alex and Maya Jade, when they start hearing about Olka, who's the woman Josie's telling them about, who explicitly mentions that Josie invited her to rise to the occasion of her life, and she recognizes that as a gift. They start talking to the residents and getting their stories, and they begin to understand that everyone has risen to the occasion of their lives in very different ways. Maya Jade's grandmother tells a story about being like an understudy in an opera and her moment. For a character named Minna, it's something as simple as sort of asking somebody to dance that changed her life. And I think we all have that in ourselves. And I don't know whether it's sort of social media or just the world we live in, but it feels like there's been lots of invitations to be our worst selves in recent years. And I know it doesn't feel good. Like it feels good in a minute, the way that like itching a scratch does, but then you're left with like a big gaping bloody wound. And so I really wanted to find a way to introduce the idea of Operation Rise out into the world and give classrooms or clubs or whatever the opportunity, a word that Alex hates, but it's such a good
Yeah.
word, to think about what it means. And so behind me, you can't see this on the podcast, but I have these posters that say, I will rise the occasion by, and I'm going to be bringing them to sort of events and schools so kids can and adults can sort of write it in. And I just think that's something for us all to think about, right? Like in those quiet moments, like who is it that I am? Who is it that I want to be? You're never going to get there. There's always going to be a gap between the two. But doing the work of working in that direction feels wonderful. It invariably connects you with other people. And I think that is the source of joy and love and the most important thing to me in the world.
And there were so many examples in the book of that, I think, on both small and large scales. So for me, thinking about there was one moment in the story where someone thought Alex was lying because
Julio has to
yeah,
apologize.
and he does, right? They get to the bottom of it. So there's that apology. And then, Alex, as you mentioned, has done something fairly unthinkable and he needs to come to terms with that. But then also you have Maya Jade, who even just in a small little interaction with her mom realizes, oh, I could change that too. I felt like there were so many different examples of what rising to the occasion could look like, both big and small, that kids, adults could take with them in their own lives too. Yeah.
I agree. I agree. I mean, we all have moments where we can step outside of ourselves and our personal needs and wants, and those are legitimate, right? But it's just, what can you do? I've heard this quote, I think it's C.S. Lewis. My friend Laura uses it a lot, and I love it so much. It's humility, and not that kids need to be worried about humility, but the rest of us do. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less.
Yeah.
And I think that it's actually wonderful to do that. It's actually wonderful to think about others. It's actually wonderful to do good for others. Like, anybody who's a do-gooder knows that the secret of it is it actually makes you happier, makes you feel better. You know, the collateral goodness is what it does for other people, but it's a selfish thing, but it's also like you're doing something outside yourself. And for me, when I'm thinking about rising to the occasion, it's always in that context for me personally. That's me. It's different for other people.
That reminds me of a quote that I won't get perfectly, because now I'm recalling it from memory, but, my Jade and Alex are having a conversation about their initial impressions of each other when they first met, which readers wasn't that great, as you'll find out. And at one point later on, as they're talking about that, I think she said something like, "You thought I was a know-it-all, or I shouldn't be a know-it-all." And he's like, "It's okay if you know it all. You just can't think no one else knows nothing." And I
Right.
thought, "Oh, what a good one for middle grade readers."
Because Maya Jade is super duper smart, right? And
Yes,
she is super duper high achieving. And, she is bossy. And I say that as a bossy woman. And I think we got to reclaim bossy as
right?
females. Um, so but yes, this idea that like both of these things can be true. Like, you can know lots of things, but so can other people. And they might not show it in the way that you expect. They both make these wrong impressions of the other. And now, Alex, on the other hand, sees her and puts her into a box that is partly true and partly not true. And it's only when Maya Jade starts telling Alex some stories about her own life that he has to grapple with the fact that somebody who has all this privilege also has heartache. It
Yeah,
does not it does not inoculate you from everything. And that moment of connection is really sort of what begins their true friendship, because he's able to step outside of himself and all of his very legitimate complaints and concerns. And so is she, and they meet somewhere where they're showing up for the other person, and they each feel better because of it. They each rise to the occasion because of it.
yeah. Everybody has a backstory, right? Even if you don't know what it is, everybody has one, including, and this just made me so happy to see, including Alex's social worker. That made me very happy
Yes, we'll
to
we'll
see in
leave
the
it at
book.
that, but yes, I was very, very, very pleased to, deliver that particular story.
And listeners, that's all we're gonna say.
That's all we're gonna say.
So as this book goes off into the world, into readers' hands, what is your hope for it? What do you hope readers will walk away of a book like this that does have all the feels?
I mean, I really cannot ask for anything more than the reaction you had, which is somebody finishing that book and just stopping and sitting with it. I think sitting with things is a superpower, and it's one that is increasingly hard in this era of, like, reactivity. So, just sitting with it and allowing it to sort of wash over them, like, to me, there's no greater hope for a book. Some other things, I would be delighted if sort of Operation Rise became or whatever version of it becomes something that kids can sort of think about and use. And I would also be very excited for intergenerational a read of this. We've actually created, and I'll send you the PDF of this after, but we've created this delightful guide, which I had so much fun making, which is like on one cover it says Guide to Understanding Your Olds, and on the other cover it says Guide to Understanding Your Youngs.
Oh, I love it.
And then you open it up and there's a glossary, and it's like slang terms that are from the teenagers, which are obviously already out of date because as soon as somebody over the age of
Right.
25 knows them, they're dead. And then other terms that like, we elders use that the kids will be like, what? But as you move in, there's open-ended questions for the youngs and the olds to ask each other that I'm hoping will help young people, whether it's with their relatives or with people in their community will help them to understand that the concerns that the 12-year-old and the 84-year-old have, like, at age 12 are quite similar.
Yeah.
That people are people are people are people. I think we tend to think that people back in the old days were so fundamentally different, and I don't think that's true. So I really hope that it gives us up that chance for that, because I think, there's a bit of an epidemic of loneliness happening in this country. And I think that the connection that could happen with the older generation and the younger generation, because it's very hard when you're 12 to, you're sort of separating from your parents at that age a lot of times, going into your peer group. This idea that you can find like this sort of these anchor adults who are not your parents. So, those are sort of my ancillary hopes of who the book reaches.
I love it. I can imagine, or I'm envisioning, family book clubs where these are read by kids and parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and all the things. And also whole school reads, whole community reads. What a perfect book for something like that. So we're gonna put that out into the world for
I
listeners
appreciate
listening that
that.
it's a perfect book for that.
Thank you.
Welcome. And while I don't want to move on from Not Nothing because I loved it so much, I do want to ask if you're working on anything else that's coming that you could give listeners a sneak peek into before we sign off.
I absolutely can, because I have a book coming out like almost in publishing terms like tomorrow. It comes out in January. It's called Afterlife. And it's about a 17-year-old girl named Amber who's riding her bike home from school one spring day. And she's thinking about her boyfriend and graduation and prom. And like she gets home and things are a little bit weird. And, you know, her mom pulls up in an unfamiliar car, sees Amber and screams because Amber died 7 years earlier riding that bike home from school. And so it's this kind of metaphysical mystery about why she's back. And it is her story, but also all these different people's stories, her family members, but also people she barely knows. And it's sort of like the ripple effect of life and death. So
Oh, I have chills. I got goosebumps when you said that one part. January. I have to wait till January.
January, yes,
Okay.
January 7th.
Okay. It's going on my reading calendar for sure.
Fantastic.
Where can listeners find you online if they want to know more about you, if they want to know more about Operation Rise, where this is the best place?
They should come to my website. It's like the first best stop, and it's Gayle Forman, and it's spelled weird in both ways. It's Gayle, F like Frank, ORMAN.com. And from there, you can sort of get to Operation Rise. You can read excerpts. You can read about all of my other books. You can figure out where to find me on social media. Educators can find a whole host of resources that we've created specifically for Not Nothing, because there's just so much opportunity. So we have all of that there. So gailforman.com.
Perfect. And I will link to that in the show notes, along with links to the books that we've mentioned today, especially Not Nothing, but also Frankie and Bug. And my other favorite, I Have Lost My Way. I'll be sure to put all of those in the show notes so that listeners can find them easily.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. This is such a treat for me to be able to talk to you about the books that I love so much.
Well, it was such a treat for me to talk to you, Stephanie. This was wonderful.
Thank you. And listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of KidLit Love, and I'll see you inside the next one. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the KidLit Love podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a bookish friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of KidLit Love. Thanks for listening.